The stars above shimmered like scattered diamonds as Arik stepped onto the surface of Zelphora, the Queen's world. The planet's sky glowed in hues of violet and green, painting the horizon with colors no human had ever seen before. Arik's breath caught in his throat, not from the thin air, but from the sheer beauty of it. Everywhere he looked, alien structures twisted like living sculptures, humming with energy that seemed alive. And somewhere in this alien paradise, the Queen ruled. He had been warned. Every diplomat, every translator, every scientist who had visited Zelphora spoke of her power. She was not just a leader. She was a force that commanded entire star systems with a glance, a whisper, a wave of her hand. But Arik had come here with no ambitions, no demands, and no illusions. He had come to survive, and perhaps, if fortune favored him, to understand. The first time he saw her, it was like a sudden eclipse. The alien queen descended from her crystalline throne, her presence cutting through the crowd of advisors, soldiers, and courtiers. Her eyes were not human. They shimmered with a strange liquid light, deep and knowing. When she looked at him, the world seemed to shrink. Every whisper, every movement, every thought around them froze. Arik felt his heart hammer, and he wondered how one being could carry so much command without lifting a finger. "You are not from here," she said, her voice a melody of power and danger, yet strangely soothing. Her words echoed in his mind rather than his ears. "Tell me who you are, human." Arik bowed slightly, wary yet steady. "I am Arik of Earth. I come in peace, your majesty." A ripple of surprise moved across her expression, subtle but undeniable. For centuries, no human had set foot on her world, and yet here he was, standing unafraid, speaking truth in the face of absolute authority. The advisors murmured among themselves, some casting worried glances at the Queen. They had not expected this. Days passed, and Arik was allowed to move through Zelphora under careful watch. He saw wonders that defied comprehension, forests of glass, rivers of liquid light, creatures that seemed woven from both shadow and flame. Every time he explored, he felt the weight of invisible eyes upon him, the Queen's gaze following even when she was elsewhere. He realized slowly that she was not merely watching. She was learning, analyzing, judging. One evening, in a garden that seemed to float over the edge of the world, he found himself speaking to her alone. They did not exchange formalities or diplomatic pleasantries. They spoke as two beings trying to understand one another. Arik told her about Earth, about its chaos, its beauty, its fragility. He spoke of humanity's curiosity, their mistakes, and their unyielding hope. And she listened, tilting her head as if tasting his words for flavor, weighing them, weighing him. Then she asked something he had not anticipated. "Why do you not fear me?" Arik's heart skipped. Most who encountered her either trembled or bowed too deeply, their spirits crushed under her mere presence. He met her eyes and said simply, "Because I have no choice but to be myself, and because I know fear is useless." There was silence. The air shimmered around them as if the planet itself held its breath. For the first time, she did not move, did not speak. And in that silence, Arik saw something deep in the alien light of her eyes, a flicker of recognition, of uncertainty. That night he lay in his quarters, staring at the ceiling and wondering if he had made a mistake. The planet's energy hummed around him, almost pulsing with anticipation. Somewhere in the palace, the Queen sat alone, staring at the stars through her crystalline walls. And though she did not move, she was not at peace. Something about this human had unsettled her in ways centuries of conquest and rule never had. Arik did not know the truth yet. He did not know how deeply he had shaken the foundations of her world, how the very air of Zelphora had grown thick with unspoken tension. But he felt it, a whisper in the wind, a tremor underfoot, a heartbeat faster than it should be. Something was changing, and neither of them could yet understand what it would bring. He had only just arrived, yet the world already seemed different. He had not planned to be a storm. He had only hoped to survive. Yet already he had touched the unshakable, and the Queen's world had begun to tremble. The palace of Zelphora had never seen a night like this. Arik wandered through its corridors, guided by a faint glow that pulsed like a heartbeat beneath the crystal floors. The hum of the city outside was distant but alive, a soft reminder that the world went on even as something unspoken shifted within its walls. He could feel it, the tension that had started the moment he had met the Queen, now growing like a storm trapped under glass. That night he was summoned unexpectedly. The doors of the throne room parted without a sound, revealing the Queen standing before him, her form radiant under the crystalline chandeliers. She did not invite him to sit. Instead, she watched him as one observes a puzzle, complex and delicate. "You move through my world as if it belongs to you," she said, her voice carrying both accusation and curiosity. "Yet you are fragile human. One misstep and all you hold dear could be lost." Eric did not flinch. "I do not move as if it belongs to me. I move because I have no other choice, and I am ready to face whatever comes." The Queen's eyes narrowed, not in anger but in genuine intrigue. For centuries, she had ruled planets, commanded armies, and bent entire civilizations to her will. And yet this human, this small, unarmed human, did not shrink. He did not cower, he did not even seem afraid. It was impossible and yet undeniable. "Most beings fear me," she said softly, almost to herself. "They fear my power, my presence, my mind. Yet you carry something they cannot understand." Eric took a cautious step closer, careful not to overstep, careful not to offend. "Perhaps I am afraid," he admitted. "But fear does not stop me from acting. You may have power over your world, but you do not have power over me, and I will not give it to you willingly." The room seemed to shiver at his words. He saw it then, a flicker, a hesitation in the Queen's movements, subtle but unmistakable. The advisors who had followed him here earlier might have assumed she was in full control, but Eric could see the truth. The Queen was unsettled. Something about him was unraveling her in ways no human had ever done. Days turned into weeks, and Eric's presence in the palace became more than a curiosity. It became a disruption. Soldiers who had once stood without question now watched him with unease. Courtiers whispered behind closed doors, wondering why he was allowed such freedom, why the Queen spent hours in conversation with him instead of the matters of state. Eric, for his part, did nothing to assert dominance. He simply existed, quietly observing, speaking only when necessary, and showing the Queen through simple acts, compassion, honesty, courage, that there was more to strength than power. Slowly, she began to test him. Challenges came in subtle forms, navigating labyrinths of crystal that shifted with thought, engaging with creatures who spoke in riddles older than time, facing illusions that could trap one's mind for eternity. Eric faced each challenge with a mixture of caution and intuition. Sometimes he failed. Sometimes he succeeded. Each time the Queen watched, her judgment sharp, her curiosity growing. And each time she found herself thinking less about the rules of her world, less about her power, and more about the human who refused to be controlled. One evening, in the floating gardens that hovered above the violet rivers, she finally asked the question that had been building in her mind. "Why do you not seek power? You could have anything you desire here, yet you ask for nothing." Eric looked at her, the stars reflecting in his eyes. "Power without understanding is meaningless. You may command worlds, but you do not command what makes me human. That cannot be taken. And perhaps that is why you are unsettled. I carry something you cannot control." The Queen's eyes widened, and for the first time she seemed small, almost vulnerable. The truth of his words sank into the crystal walls, into the air itself. She had never faced anyone who could speak so plainly, so honestly, while remaining entirely untouchable in spirit. That night, as Eric slept in his quarters, the palace hummed with unease. Somewhere in the throne room, the Queen sat alone, her mind a storm of thoughts she could not fully name. The truth he carried, a truth of freedom, courage, and humanity, had begun to erode the foundations of her certainty. Eric had not come as a conqueror. He had not come as a diplomat. He had come simply as a human, and that had been enough to shake the alien Queen to her core. And in the quiet pulse of Zelphora, the world trembled, not from weapons, not from armies, but from a simple truth. Some things, no matter how powerful, could never be commanded. The palace of Zelphora buzzed with an energy that had nothing to do with technology or magic. It was different, wild, unpredictable. Eric had begun to notice it in the way guards faltered in their steps, in the way advisors whispered behind closed crystal doors. Something about him unsettled the balance of the Queen's world. And that night, he realized he was no longer merely a visitor. He had become a ripple, and ripples could grow into waves. The Queen appeared before him in the grand observation hall, where floating platforms hovered above a shimmering violet lake. Her presence was more intense than ever, the light in her eyes flickering with a mixture of curiosity and unease. She did not bow or demand. She simply regarded him, as if weighing the gravity of his existence against the might of her empire. "You've changed my world," she said softly, almost in disbelief. "Not with weapons, not with politics, but with something I cannot touch." Eric met her gaze steadily. "I do not seek to change your world, I only live in it, and yet sometimes living is enough to make a difference." Her lips pressed together, the faintest sign of hesitation passing across her face. Centuries of ruling had taught her that no one could move her, that fear and respect were enough to keep order. And yet here was a human, untamed, untouchable in ways she could not comprehend. The next days were filled with challenges unlike anything Eric had anticipated. She summoned creatures from the farthest reaches of her world, beasts that shimmered with shifting colors and eyes that could pierce memory itself. They tested not his strength, but his heart, his courage, his ability to remain unshaken in the face of incomprehensible danger. Each trial left Eric more exhausted, yet more determined. He began to see the world differently, not just the alien landscapes, but the delicate threads that connected the Queen to her people. He saw the burdens she carried, the expectations and fear she wielded like a shield. And with every insight, he began to understand why she trembled, not from him, but from the reflection of what she might lose. One evening, the Queen brought him to the edge of a cliff where the violet rivers met the horizon. The wind carried whispers of ancient histories, of wars fought and worlds conquered. "Why do you endure?" she asked. "Why do you face what others would flee? Humanity is fragile, your kind is short-lived, your life fleeting compared to the span of my rule. Why risk yourself?" Eric looked out at the rivers below, watching the light twist and shimmer. Because living fully is stronger than ruling endlessly. Because even a brief spark can ignite change. You may have built an empire that lasts 1,000 years, but it is bound by fear and obedience. I do not need to conquer to be remembered. For a moment, the Queen said nothing. The wind seemed to pause, the stars holding their breath. Then she finally spoke, her voice trembling slightly, not with anger, but with the faintest echo of awe. "You are unlike anything I have ever known, and that frightens me more than any enemy ever could." Eric felt a strange warmth in her words, a recognition he could not explain. She had never faced someone whose truth could not be bent, whose courage could not be shaken. And for the first time, she realized that her power, immense though it was, had limits, limits she had never considered until now. The days that followed were quieter, yet heavier. Eric noticed subtle shifts in the palace. Guards who once acted without thought now paused, waiting for a sign. Advisors who once whispered instructions now hesitated, unsure of the right path. The Queen moved differently, more deliberately, as if every decision was now filtered through the lens of his presence. One night, as he wandered through a garden of floating flowers that glowed like moons, Eric felt a ripple beneath his feet. It was not the energy of the planet itself. It was something deeper, something personal. He realized then that he had become a mirror, reflecting the Queen's own doubts and vulnerabilities back to her. And in that reflection, she had begun to tremble, not from fear of him, but from fear of herself. He understood finally that his arrival was no accident. The universe had placed him here for a reason, to challenge not with violence or cunning, but with the simple truth of being human. And the Queen, for all her power, could not deny it. The world of Zelphora had already begun to change, and neither Eric nor the Queen could know what it would demand next. The sun on Zelphora never truly set, but the violet light of evening draped the world in shadows that seemed alive. Eric wandered through the floating city, his footsteps echoing softly across the crystal streets. Everywhere he looked, the subtle signs of change made him pause. The guards, disciplined formations wavered, advisors exchanged hesitant glances, and even the wind seemed to carry an undercurrent of tension. He had become more than a visitor. He was now an unseen force, a presence that the Queen's world could not ignore. The Queen herself summoned him at dawn, her voice echoing through the hall with an urgency he had not heard before. When he entered, she was not seated upon her throne. She stood at the edge of a balcony, overlooking the rivers of liquid light that wound like veins through the city. Her form shimmered with energy, more brilliant and terrifying than ever, yet there was an uncharacteristic tension in the way she held herself. "You have unsettled more than just my mind," she said, her voice firm yet fragile. My people, they feel it too. Their loyalty wavers, their confidence falters. And I cannot tell whether it is you or the reflection of my own fears that shakes them." Eric stepped closer, careful to remain respectful yet unafraid. "I do not wish to shake your world, your majesty. I wish only to exist, to speak truths, and to act as a human in a place that expects nothing less than perfection." Her eyes, liquid and unyielding, held his for a long moment. "Perfection is an illusion," she whispered, almost to herself. "And yet I have clung to it all these centuries. You remind me how fragile my foundation really is." The days that followed were unlike any Eric had experienced. The Queen's world began to feel unpredictable, almost dangerous. Rivers of energy that once flowed calmly now pulsed violently, as if responding to the tension in her mind. The crystalline structures groaned under subtle shifts, and creatures who had always obeyed her commands began to act with curiosity, even defiance. Eric realized that her uncertainty had become a ripple that stretched through every corner of the planet. One afternoon, he wandered into a chamber where the air shimmered with raw energy. The Queen appeared behind him without a sound, her form glowing brighter than ever. "You cannot imagine what your presence has done," she said. "I am losing control over what I have ruled for centuries. My advisors question every order I give, and my own mind, it does not obey me as it once did." Eric turned to face her fully. "Perhaps control is not the measure of strength. Perhaps the measure is courage, honesty, and truth. You are powerful, yes, but even the most powerful cannot command what is real." Her eyes widened. There was a flicker of something almost human in her gaze. Fear, confusion, awe. She stepped back, energy pulsing around her as if the very air responded to her emotions. "You speak truths I have ignored for centuries," she said, her voice breaking. "And they terrify me. You have made me doubt myself." For the first time, she seemed vulnerable, a queen stripped of certainty, confronted with a truth she could not bend. Eric felt an unfamiliar surge of empathy. He did not move closer, did not offer comfort in words. Instead, he stood quietly, letting her confront the storm she could not escape. That night, Zelphora itself seemed restless. Rivers glowed erratically, the sky shimmered with alien hues, and the palace thrummed with tension. Eric realized that his existence alone had become a force of change. The Queen's power was immense, but it was rooted in order and fear. Where he stood, both were challenged, and the consequences were unpredictable. He wandered the floating gardens once more, watching the alien flowers glow with strange patterns. Somewhere in the distance, the Queen watched too, her mind racing with the possibilities that his presence had unlocked. She could feel her empire trembling, not because of rebellion, not because of war, but because one human had reminded her that perfection, control, and fear were fragile foundations. Eric did not yet understand the full impact he had caused. He had come seeking understanding, yet he had shaken a world to its core without even trying. And the Queen, for all her strength, could no longer hide the tremors that his truth had ignited within her. The night deepened, and the violet rivers reflected the stars like molten silver. Somewhere inside the palace, the Queen sat alone, contemplating a human who had done what no weapon, no conquest, and no strategy ever could: make her question everything she thought she knew about power, loyalty, and control. And in that quiet, trembling world, Eric felt a single, undeniable truth. Sometimes, simply being oneself could change the course of a planet, the heart of a queen, and the destiny of a world. The next day, the city of Zelphora felt different, though no one could put a name to it. The floating towers shimmered with unusual light, and even the rivers seemed to pulse with a rhythm that spoke of uncertainty. Eric walked through the streets, noticing the subtle ways the Queen's unease had spread. Soldiers who once moved like clockwork now paused at intersections, debating orders they would have once followed without question. Courtiers whispered in corners, exchanging anxious glances. A single human had become the axis upon which the world tilted. The Queen summoned him once more, but this time the meeting was not in the throne room or the gardens. She led him to a chamber deep beneath the palace, carved into the very core of the planet, where the air shimmered with energy so raw it made his skin tingle. The walls pulsed as if alive, and the light reflected off crystal surfaces in a way that made it impossible to tell where reality ended and illusion began. "You have done what no being has done in millennia," the queen said, her voice low and trembling. You have exposed the fragility of my reign, the doubt within my advisors, and even the cracks in my own certainty. Tell me, why do you not use this? Eric stepped carefully across the glowing floor. I do not wish to rule or dominate. I only wish to live honestly, to face truth, and to act with courage. If my presence unsettles things, it is not my intent. It is simply a reflection of what is real. She studied him, and for a long moment the energy around them seemed to hold its breath. You speak of courage, she whispered, but your courage frightens me more than any weapon, any army, any conquest ever could. You remind me that my power is built on fear, not truth. Eric nodded. Power built on fear is never absolute. Eventually it falters, cracks, or breaks, but truth endures even if it is fragile. The queen's eyes softened, but the tension in her shoulders did not ease. She began packing, her movements both graceful and sharp, as though trying to shake off a weight she could not name. You have made me question everything, she said, her voice almost breaking. The loyalty of my people, the wisdom of my decisions, the meaning of my own power. I do not know what is real anymore. Eric stepped closer, careful not to overstep the invisible boundaries between them. Perhaps the uncertainty is not a weakness. Perhaps it is the first step toward something stronger, something genuine. You can choose to learn, to grow, instead of clinging to fear. For a moment the queen's form glowed brighter, the energy around her reacting violently to her emotions. Then slowly the tension began to ease, though the uncertainty remained. She took a deep breath, her hand brushing the crystals at her side as if seeking balance. I have ruled for centuries, she said softly, and I have never faced someone like you. I do not know how to respond to truth that is not a threat. Eric looked at her steadily, his voice calm and gentle. You do not have to respond with power. You can respond with understanding, with honesty. You can admit that even a queen can be uncertain, that even the strongest can tremble. The words hung in the air, and for the first time the queen allowed herself to feel fully. The fear, the awe, the recognition that her world had shifted because of one human's presence. The rivers outside glowed brighter, the air pulsed with anticipation, and even the stars seemed to lean closer, listening to the unspoken truths that flowed between them. Days turned into nights without distinction, and the palace itself seemed alive with reflection. Eric continued to move through it with quiet purpose, his simple presence challenging every assumption she had ever held. And with each passing day, the queen found herself trembling, not from fear of him, but from the knowledge that her world, her empire, her life, could no longer be the same. The human before her carried no armies, no weapons, no claims to power. And yet he had done what centuries of conquest could not. He had made the alien queen confront her own vulnerabilities, her own fears, her own truths. That evening, as Eric watched the rivers glow beneath the violet sky, he realized that the queen's world had begun to transform, not through violence or control, but through honesty, courage, and the fragile strength of being human. And somewhere deep within the palace, the queen sat alone, contemplating the human who had reminded her that even the mightiest could tremble when faced with something they could not command. The tension in Zelphora had grown to a point where even the air seemed heavy. The floating towers pulsed with a faint glow that mirrored the unrest below, and the rivers of liquid light churned with currents no one had seen before. Eric moved carefully through the city, sensing the change in every footstep, every whisper, every glance. The queen's world was trembling, and the tremor was no longer subtle. It was a wave moving outward, touching everything she had ever controlled. That morning the queen summoned him to the Hall of Reflections, a vast chamber lined with mirrors of living crystal that showed not only the present but echoes of the past. Her form was radiant, yet her eyes were restless. She did not speak at first, allowing the mirrors themselves to hum with energy, reflecting their shared history, the empire's triumphs and its hidden weaknesses. Finally, she turned to him. Your presence has grown beyond my expectations, she said. It is no longer just my mind you unsettle. The advisors, the people, even the creatures of this world act differently when you are near. Tell me, human, do you understand the power you wield? Eric shook his head slowly. I do not wield power, he said softly. I only exist, And yet perhaps that is enough to show what true strength is, not control, not fear, but courage, honesty, and the ability to face reality without hiding. Her eyes flickered, and for the first time he saw her uncertainty break through the armor of her authority. "Centuries of rule, and no one has ever spoken to me like this," she whispered. "I am not used to weakness or truth, and yet here you are, standing unshaken in my presence." Eric stepped closer, careful and deliberate. Perhaps it is not weakness to feel, to question, to tremble. Even the strongest need to confront themselves. You have built empires, conquered worlds, and shaped destinies, but none of that can teach what it means to be human. That lesson comes from living, from daring to be honest in a world that expects perfection. For a long moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the soft hum of the living crystal. Then the queen spoke, her voice trembling as if the weight of centuries had finally found its limit. "I am afraid," she admitted. "Afraid that the world I have shaped so carefully can crumble because of truth, because of honesty, because of a human who refuses to be bent or broken." Eric's gaze softened. "Fear does not make you weak," he said. "It makes you aware, and awareness is the first step to change, the first step to understanding." The queen's energy flared around her, casting shadows that danced across the walls, mirrors, and ceiling. She paced, her thoughts racing faster than the rivers outside. "I have ruled with certainty for centuries," she said. "Every decision, every command, every order followed perfectly until you arrived, and now I cannot tell what is real anymore. The foundations of my empire, even my own mind, tremble." Eric nodded, understanding the depth of the shift. Sometimes the world must tremble to grow. Sometimes the strongest cannot hold everything in place. And sometimes one person who acts with honesty and courage can change what centuries of power could not. For the first time, the queen seemed to hesitate completely, as if the walls, the air, the rivers themselves had conspired to challenge her perception of control. She reached out, touching the living crystal that lined the chamber, and the reflections flickered, showing her not as a perfect ruler, but as a being capable of doubt, fear, and growth. "I do not know if I can accept this," she admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper. "That one human has done what no army or empire ever could. You have revealed my fragility, and now my world trembles." Eric stepped back, giving her space. "And yet perhaps that trembling is a gift," he said. "Perhaps it is the first step toward something stronger, something genuine. You can choose to let it break you, or you can choose to let it teach you." The queen stared at him, the violet light reflecting in her eyes like molten stars. She felt the tremor in her heart, the uncertainty in her mind, and the undeniable truth that his presence, his humanity, was reshaping everything she thought she knew about power, loyalty, and life itself. Outside, the rivers glowed brighter than ever, the floating towers pulsed with new energy, and the city of Zelphora waited, trembling for what would come next. And in the Hall of Reflections, two beings, one human, one alien queen, stood facing the inevitability of change, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. The violet rivers of Zelphora shimmered brighter than ever, reflecting a sky that seemed alive with countless stars. Eric stood at the edge of the floating city, feeling the pulse of the world beneath his feet. He could sense the tremor that had begun when he first arrived, now spreading outward like waves through the heart of the planet. Every crystal tower, every living river, every creature of this alien realm seemed to pause, waiting for the next movement, the next decision, the next truth. The queen appeared behind him silently, her form radiant yet softened, no longer rigid with the certainty of absolute power. Her eyes met his, and for the first time she looked entirely human in the emotions they reflected. Awe, vulnerability, curiosity, and perhaps something that felt dangerously like hope. "You have done the impossible," she said softly, almost in wonder. "My world trembled because of you, not with fear of loss, but because I finally see things I could not see before. I see myself." Eric turned to her, his voice calm, yet filled with quiet conviction. "You do not have to fear what has changed. You have faced it, acknowledged it, and now you can choose what to do with it. Trembling does not mean weakness. It means growth. It means life." The queen paused, gazing at the glowing rivers, the floating gardens, and the shimmering towers. "I have ruled with certainty for centuries," she admitted. "Every decision, every conquest, every law, I believed they defined my strength. Yet all along I had forgotten that strength can come from truth, from courage, from seeing beyond fear. Eric stepped closer, letting the glow of the alien sky wash over them both. Power built on fear can be taken away, but power built on understanding, respect, and truth, that endures. For a long moment, silence enveloped them. Then, as if the world itself had been waiting for this acknowledgement, the rivers pulsed in a steady rhythm, the floating towers seemed to sway gently, and the alien creatures moved without tension. Zelphora, shaken to its core, began to settle, not as it was before, but stronger, freer, and more alive than ever. The Queen turned fully to Eric, her voice carrying a weight he had never heard before. "You have reminded me that being unshakable is not true strength. Being human, flawed, courageous, honest, is." She paused, her gaze softening. "And now I understand that my rule does not require fear to endure. Perhaps it requires honesty, empathy, and the willingness to let go of control." Eric smiled faintly. "Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand and be real. That is enough to change even the most unyielding world." A calm descended over Zelphora, yet it was not the stillness of fear or order. It was alive, vibrant, and full of promise. The palace seemed less like a cage and more like a home. The rivers reflected not just the stars above, but the possibilities ahead. Even the air seemed lighter, carrying the scent of alien blooms and the faint hum of renewed energy. The Queen reached out and Eric did not flinch. Their hands almost touched, a gesture of connection across the vast gulf of species, centuries, and experiences. "You have shaken my world," she said softly, "but in doing so, you have given it a chance to breathe." Eric nodded, understanding the magnitude of what had happened. He had arrived as a stranger, a human with no weapons, no armies, no claims to power. And yet, through his presence, his honesty, and his courage, he had changed an empire, a planet, and the heart of its ruler. She turned her gaze back to the horizon, to the rivers glowing under the eternal twilight. "Perhaps now," she whispered, "my world can learn what it means to truly live and not merely survive." Eric looked out beside her, feeling the quiet thrill of a world transformed. And perhaps humans and aliens alike can see that the strongest hearts are those that face truth, even when it trembles. The violet rivers shimmered like molten silver, the floating towers glowed in harmonious light, and the sky above Zelphora stretched endlessly, full of possibility. The Queen's world, once ruled with unyielding fear and certainty, now breathed with life, wonder, and a newfound understanding. And somewhere deep in the energy of the planet, a single truth resonated. Even the mightiest can tremble, and in that trembling lies the seed of something greater. Eric smiled, feeling the warmth of that truth. He had come as a human, fragile in body but unshakable in spirit. And in doing so, he had left a mark no empire, no conquest, and no weapon could ever erase. The alien Queen's world had trembled, and in trembling it had awakened.